à HGD. Aujourd'hui, nous sommes heureux de présenter Dr. Carolyn Whitzman. Dr. Whitzman is a researcher, consultant, and advocate focused on housing and planning policy, specifically advancing different rights to the city. Her career began in 1989 in the city of Toronto, where she developed public policy to prevent gender-based violence, and then found her way to the University of Melbourne, where she was a professor of urban planning. She has authored, co-authored, and edited several books and book chapters where she fronts feminist theory, and some of those books include Building Inclusive Cities, Women's Safety and the Right to the City, which focuses on women's rights and access to safety in the context of poverty reduction and social inclusion in developing countries. She draws on her cross-cultural knowledges to join forces with different policymakers from local and international levels at the UN to advocate for social and political change. And she has contributed a whole bunch and has done really awesome work. So I will now hand the stage over to Dr. Carolyn Whitzman.
Thank you, Brandon. I want to acknowledge before I go any further that I'm presenting today from the unceded land of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people, and we have much to learn from their housing practices, past and present. Thank you very much for this opportunity for me to do the first real public presentation on a project that just got started a few weeks ago, which we're calling Housing Assessment Readiness Tools, or HART for short. Once you have a good acronym, half your work is done. So what I'm going to be talking about a little bit today is what it is, why it's necessary, and I hope to make numbers kind of fun for you today, because I'm a policy person who actually loves numbers. So the HART project is a two-stage development of a housing need and land assessment, two different tools that hopefully are going to get rolled out to all three levels of Canadian government. As I say, we found out about being awarded the money in March. For about 6 months, we're going to be testing out a prototype with the city of Kelowna in BC. And then if the second stage is funded, we'll be rolling it out for the next 18 months or so in a number of other communities in Canada and develop a training module. This work is funded by the CMHC, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, which is Canada's housing agency, and also an organization, a federal organization called Impact Canada that looks at innovation. It's based at UBC, the Housing Research Collaborative there, but Professor Mike Sawada, who's also here today, and I are on the research team, and we're both affiliated with the University of Ottawa, and we also are working with Martine Auguste, who is a researcher at University of Waterloo. It's got a great advisory committee of organizations that have been doing really good thinking about needs assessment and land assessment, primarily based in BC, which is a little bit ahead of Ontario. So we've got the Aboriginal Housing Management Association, which is an industry body based in BC that works in Indigenous housing. BC has a very big community land trust, about 2,000 homes. There's one that just started in Ottawa with maybe about 200. The BC government, the Nonprofit Housing Association, which has a really great rental housing index used across Canada, 3 cities, Kelowna, Toronto, and Vancouver, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, and Van City Credit Union, who are also kind of awesome. So when we talk about housing need in Canada, there's sort of one number that we can agree on and that has a good definition, and that's sort of where it stops. That's about 1.7 million households in Canada as of the last census in 2016 who are in housing need. And the definition of housing need is pretty straightforward, accepted across Canada. It's one of 3 or a combination of the 3 of paying over 30% of your gross household income on rent or mortgage payments, and or your home is in very poor repair, and or you're overcrowded, which has a little bit of a complex definition, but it's basically more than one person per room. Housing need isn't distributed evenly across Canada or across different kinds of households. So the first thing to note and it was there in that first slide, is that 23% of renters are in housing need and only 6.5% of owners. People in high-rise apartments are more likely to be in housing need than people in semi-detached houses, unsurprisingly. One thing that's come really to the fore only in the last couple of years is that if you're a member of a racialized community, you're almost twice as likely to be in housing need than if you're not a member of a racialized community. Some other grounds of inequality. Senior-led households are slightly more likely to be in housing need, and that's only going to increase over time as the number of senior-led households, particularly women-led senior households, increases. If you're an Indigenous household, you're certainly more likely to be in housing need. If you're a new migrant over the last 5 years, you're much more likely to be in housing need. And definitely, if you're a single mom, you're much more likely to be in housing need. But the biggest determinant of housing need is, unsurprisingly, income. So if you look at the lowest income quartile, that's people who earn less than 40% of the median income across Canada. And this is from 2 censuses ago, 2011, over half are in housing need. If you look the next income quartile, so people earning between 40 and 80% of median income in Canada, a little over 10%, 1 in 10 are in housing need. And if you're looking at middle income people, there's a small but a growing number of people in housing need, and then rich people aren't necessarily in housing need. One of the stereotypes of homeless people is a middle-aged man with perhaps substance abuse or mental illness issues. Actually, a lot of the people who are most at risk of homelessness and who are in what's often called hidden homelessness, doubling up with another family, couch surfing, staying in violent relationships, those are women-led households, and those, of course, aren't single people and don't need super cheap one-bedrooms with 2 or 3 children. They need larger households. So it's really important to look at the need for low-income housing that's low rent, no matter how many bedrooms it has. But generally, we're building studio and 1-bedroom apartments for very low-income households. Governments generally don't have price point targets, and I could go on and on with the targets of the National Housing Strategy, where there's a lot of double counting in this very widely used chart, and it's also already a little bit out of date, which is good news. The targets have been adjusted somewhat. But the Canadian government's been talking about everyone living in an adequate home and eradicating homelessness by 2030. These targets have nothing to do with that. So these targets say we'll deal with about 1/3 of the 1.7 million households who are in housing need. We'll remove them from housing need. And the other number to look at is 50%. We'll deal with 50% of the people who are in chronic homelessness, who are generally people who've been in the shelter system or sleeping rough for over 4 months. Half of them over the next 10 years will find housing for the other half, and any number that grows from that deficit, they're left on their own. So the National Housing Strategy, for all of its flaws, and there are many flaws, came out in January of 2018. It's one of 3 game changers that have happened in the last 3 or 4 years. The second, and it sounds similar, but it isn't, was the National Housing Strategy Act in 2019, where for the first time, the Government of Canada said housing is a right. And that's really important. It not only brings us in line with UN goals, but it commits Canada to the gradual elimination of homelessness, not having it over 10 years, but eliminating it over a period of time. A focus on the most marginalized groups, and I've talked a bit about who those marginalized groups are, and I'll talk a bit more in a moment. And it also talks about a National Housing Council, which has just been named, and an advocate who has not yet been named, who will focus on independent monitoring of the targets that the federal government sets and also provincial and municipal governments set, and also will grapple with institutional barriers to meeting those targets. So that's a very significant piece of legislation. The third game changer, of course, is COVID, and COVID has been both exposing and amplifying inequalities. You can't shelter in place if you don't have a home to shelter in, and particularly if you're sharing a bathroom or a kitchen in congregate settings like shelters or rooming houses, it becomes very difficult to stay safe from COVID. The other thing that's been happening, of course, is that there was an eviction moratorium in, for instance, Ontario, but there were 6,000 eviction applications filed during the eviction ban, which went from April, I believe, to July. Since then, there's been a reestablished eviction moratorium, but the numbers are really starting to grow in terms of what I've heard referred to as a K-shaped recovery, where comfortable white-collar workers such as myself can stay at home, and people who are deemed essential workers have actually been losing jobs quite a bit. 60% of those who've lost their jobs are women with young children, just to give one example. And 50% of renters are less than a month away from eviction, i.e. their savings are less than a month's rent. So one of the issues that's been really poorly dealt with in housing policy and needs assessment is the issue of losing affordable housing. Great, you're building new affordable housing. What's happening at the same time? So an Ottawa colleague, Steve Pomeroy, who's based at Carleton, did some research and found that for every one new affordable home at less than $750 a month rent, built between 2011 and 2016, the last census period that we can count, 15 affordable homes were lost. So if you're losing affordable homes much more quickly than you're building affordable homes, homelessness will not end, housing need will grow. And we're not really focusing enough on that loss of affordable homes. And the loss happens partly because of what's called demoviction. So affordable housing, rental housing being torn down for condos or for single family houses. Sometimes, ironically, affordable rooming houses are torn down for new buildings that have inclusionary zoning. Who cares? Low-income housing has been lost. About 2/3 of the affordable housing has been lost because of rent increases. And as we know in Ontario, there's rent control, but there's something called vacancy decontrol, which is once a tenant moves out, the rent can be raised to market rate, and that's when trouble begins. And the need in Ottawa isn't in this graph, but Ottawa would be somewhere between Toronto and Vancouver that have literally zero affordable housing for the lowest 20% of income. Be somewhere between the Toronto and Vancouver and Calgary number. In other words, there's virtually no affordable housing for very low income people. This inability to look at income categories leads to some really, really bad policy decisions. And again, I'm going to use Steve Pomeroy's work. In September 2020, the Prime Minister in his throne speech said, we're going to end homelessness by 2030. And we've got this new program that's going to be awesome. It's called the Rapid Housing Initiative. And we're going to give money to municipalities and also to community organizations to build 3,000 new homes across Canada in the next 18 months to house long-term homeless people, which is fantastic. It was a new program. It was out of COVID. The problem is that at the same time, they gave 12 times as much, $12 billion to something called the Rental Construction Finance Initiative. That brought up that continuing initiative to almost $26 billion, which is 40% of the money under the National Housing Strategy. It's been 85% of the increased budget since the strategy was announced in 2018. And what it is funding for purpose-built rental in return for 20% of that rental building being affordable for 10 years. But the definition of affordability that's being used in that program comes out to about 141% of median rent in Toronto, where median rent is about 4 times higher than shelter allowance. And another definition that's sometimes used of affordability, 80% of market rent, I should say, is about 3 times shelter allowance. So this is completely unaffordable housing for people who need the most. And I've got these 2 illustrations to show you what 12 times as much looks like. Needs assessment isn't rocket science. In 1944, during World War II, there was a Curtis Commission that looked at housing need in Canada and said, look, if you look at the lowest income third of Canada, there's no way that we're going to be producing rental that is affordable to them. So we're going to need social housing for about 1/3 of Canadian households. For the next 1/3 of Canadian households, moderate income folks, not low income folks, we're going to need rental, but we're going to make sure that we're going to need to make sure that the rents are low. The highest income people, yep, they can buy houses. Let's worry a little bit less about them. But unfortunately, that report wasn't listened to. 20 years later, Singapore had just won independence from the British Empire. It did a needs assessment. It said lots and lots of housing that is overcrowded and in poor repair. We need 80,000 new units to meet that deficit. We know we're going to need to redevelop the central city. Again, a lot of shop houses in really poor shape. So that's going to be loss of affordable housing. We're going to need to build 20,000 more homes in order to meet that expected loss of affordable housing. And we also know that population is rapidly increasing. Lots of people are having kids. So lots of people are going to be moving to Singapore from Malaysia. We're going to need 47,000 new homes to deal with population increase over the next 10 years. So we're going to need to build 147,000 homes in the next 10 years. That's going to be at least 14,000 new homes a year. And they did it. And now Singapore has a very high proportion of people in publicly built housing and almost no people who are homeless in Singapore. So all you need to do is look at the deficit of households, look at what price points need to be, homes at what price points need to be produced. You need to look at what kind of affordable housing you're projected to lose over the next 10 years and replace that. And then you need to look at what kind of population growth, what kind of change is occurring. For instance, is it an aging society? Is it a young society? What proportion of immigration is happening? And come up with a figure that takes A, B, and C, and you've got housing need. It's not that hard. It's been going on for a long time, but Canadian governments, and I'm talking here about provincial and municipal as well as federal, have lost that little ability to do that. Again, using income categories is not rocket science. So the city of Vancouver has been doing it for a while. It uses 6 income categories. I'm going to suggest 5 income categories. So the lowest income category, which they call very low income households, is people who earn about 20% of the median income in Vancouver, which is about 68,000 a year. And they are not going to have their needs met by the market. They need social housing, they need supportive housing. The same goes for low income people, people who earn between 20 and 50% of median income. They are not going to be able to afford purpose-built rental. Don't even start, just build more social housing. When you get to moderate income households that are earning about 50 to about 80%, they can probably afford purpose-built rental in Vancouver. When you look at average income people, they still aren't going to be able to afford home ownership. That's not going to be a thing in Vancouver for the next while. But they can afford maybe some condo, maybe a condo, maybe a laneway house, possibly. And then higher income people, well, they can afford a full range of housing, but at the same time, there's surprisingly few of them that are in housing needs. So let's focus on the lower income categories. Here's an illustration from Alaska, and I only am including it. It uses slightly different categories. So the less than 20% are called extremely low income households. To say, it gives you a sense of kinds of households that you're building for. So when you're looking at very low income households, we're talking about single women with children, seniors on a fixed income, people who have various disabilities and may or may not need supportive housing, and homeless people. That's who you're building for. It's not just guys on the street. If you're looking at low income households, that means working poor folks, people in service industries, secretaries, janitors, hairstylists. Those folks are, they've got a number of people or households, and that's who you're building for. When it comes to what I'd call moderate income households between 50 and 80, you're talking about skilled workers, perhaps on starting salaries. And when you're looking at what I'd call average income workers, they call median income households. That's usually the kind of key workers that we often talk about. So it's a good infographic. It gives you a sense of numbers. It gives you a sense of who you're building for. Mix some people. It would be great. The federal government talks a lot about a gender and intersectional analysis. It has a target of 25% of housing for women and girl head of households. It doesn't say why 25. There's no number that supports that 25% target, but it's nice that they have a target. So you need to break down housing need definitely by indigeneity, and the federal government promised a for Indigenous by Indigenous strategy, but it's still not happened yet. You definitely have to look at scaling up housing for women, particularly larger households. You definitely need to look at Black people and other racialized people quite often get displaced by loss of affordable housing. You need to look at all kinds of different groups in order to make sure that you're providing appropriate as well as affordable housing. So I recently returned to Canada from Australia, where I was for about 16 years. And for the last 6 of those years, I led a partnership at the University of Melbourne that had local and state government, private and nonprofit developers, social and mainstream finance. And basically our question was to all of those groups, what do you need to know in order to create more affordable housing? And what we found was that there was a lot of lack of clarity over affordable housing, just as areas in Canada. What does it mean? What do we need to know about it? So we helped the state government come up with an income-based definition of affordable housing and helped affordable housing become an aim of the Planning Act. Believe it or not, it wasn't. Producing affordable housing wasn't an aim of the Planning Act before then. And we helped them map land for suitability for affordable housing. And that in turn became the basis for local government housing plans. And basically we built alliances between groups that could do some interesting pilots and then scale them. The illustration here is a rooming house built above a parking lot. I'll talk about it a little bit more in a moment. Now, don't hold me to these numbers. Part of what we're trying to do here is put real numbers on guesstimates. So these are total guesstimate numbers, projecting 1% growth per year at the same income categories, assuming average census household sizes. I've done a lot of shortcuts here. But if we were to come up with a good needs assessment underpinning a 10-year strategy, which just got released by the city government in Ottawa, you'd be looking at about 30,000 new homes to help meet the deficit for very low income households. That would be affordable at about $500 a month, which is about the same as shelter allowance. you'd need about 40,000 new homes that were available at a much higher amount, 1125, but still lower than current market rents. And again, all kinds of sizes for low-income people. You'd need about 20,000 more because the deficit's a little bit less for households earning, households that are about $1,750 a month. And then you'd need about 30,000 for all average and higher income households. Presently, the total numbers, 120,000, isn't unrealistic at all. It's about what Ottawa's been producing, given that it's a smaller population. The problem isn't so much a housing shortage, it's that it's an affordable housing shortage. And a good needs assessment is a tool to go, yeah, we need to start looking at houses at particular price points or homes at particular price points, not just generic housing, because it's not going to be a good fit for a lot of people. So let's talk a little bit about land assessment. That's how can we address the hemorrhage, the 15-to-1 loss of well-located NOAA, naturally occurring affordable housing. And absolutely, rent control has a place, and the provincial government has a huge place in preventing evictions into homelessness. But one of the things that the municipal government can do, supported by the federal government, is acquire as many cheap properties as possible as social housing before it gets bought up by real estate investment trusts, as happened in Herongate a few years ago and as continues to happen. Another thing that can happen is to scale up nonprofit housing to about 1/3 of all homes. And again, that was a recommendation in 1944 in the Curtis Commission. It was even higher in 1972. You can't wish it away that you need a lot of social housing in order to prevent homelessness. Finland knows it. It's been reducing and is close to eradicating homelessness. There's no shortcut. You need more social housing. And one of the big ways to do that is to use all appropriate government and other nonprofit land for social housing. And another way to actually make sure that everyone has a home that's affordable and appropriate is to have targets, not inclusionary zoning, but actual targets saying we're going to produce X number of this per year. And the city of Montreal is moving towards that concept. And so is Vancouver. So there's a lot of studies that have happened recently. There's a really cool Metro Vancouver study that happened a couple of years ago. How do you make housing cheaper? Well, they found that the biggest discount in all scenarios, free land, using wood framing as opposed to concrete, which makes a big difference in BC where there's a lot of trees, is using a social developer, which is why they're scaling up social housing providers. That can, depending on the cost of land, shave off between 15 and 30% of the cost, because land's a big cost. Sorry, I'm conflating two. 15 to 30% profit plus land, 15 to 30%. Looking at parking requirements and zoning in general would have a big impact on the number of potential sites as well as their viability. And looking at accelerated approvals is another cost, because there's the cost of holding the land, the impact on the viability of a project of keeping land for 18 months to 5 years while you get funding and approvals, etc. We're hearing a lot in Ottawa about 15 or 20-minute neighborhoods. That just means things that are 5-minute, 10-minute, 15-minute walks away, things like a good park, a playground, a convenience store, a primary school, a secondary school, a supermarket, etc. And there's been a lot of work done. This is from Shanghai, but it actually would be the same in Canada about what kind of densities you'd need in order to keep that transit moving. What we did in Melbourne was we came up with a very simple 20-point scale of access to some basic things for affordable housing, groceries, public transit, schools, libraries, recreation centers, healthcare, etc. And then we put it on a map, and it looked like this. So this is a well-served part of just west of downtown in Melbourne, and little purple bits are government-owned land. Some of it is above a big public market that's in Footscray. Some of it is former defense land. Some of it is road allowance that's not being used. And we actually got some temporary modular housing on the road allowance that wasn't being used. So that was a bit of a win. So anything over 10 out of 20, we said, yeah, that's pretty suitable land for, or the most suitable land for high intensity development. And then we did some projections about how much you could build on the government land, how much social housing, and we came up with a number of 30,000, which not coincidentally was the target. One of the big wins, and we're seeing this around the world right now, is using what we call lazy land, and that's single story uses or ground level uses. You can build housing on top of it. So from left to right, this is a new health center with some seniors housing on top on Carling Avenue in Ottawa. The picture in the middle, which I showed you before, is a shopping center parking lot that is a neighborhood street parking lot, like if you imagine Wellington West. The parking lot still exists. There's a 3-story wonderful rooming house, new rooming house built on top of it. And the picture on the right is a new library in the city of Vancouver with, I think, 4 stories of housing for women and children on top of it. So think 3-dimensionally. In conclusion, and again, here's some pictures from that rooming house in South Melbourne. The people living there were, those 3 people had lived in South Melbourne for a total of 100 years. They'd been displaced. They needed somewhere to live. They're senior years in. If you have easy to use tools to improve equity, consistency, comparability between governments, compare policy outcomes, if you have tools that are easy enough for smaller communities, that's part of the reason why we're working with Kelowna, who don't need to rely on consultants. If you have easily available information, then you're getting somewhere. So we're going to have that prototype hopefully done by the end of August. We'll have a scaling up proposal by September, and if successful, we'll test it out to 3 or 4 more communities by March of 2023. Okay. Thank you. Now ask lots of questions.
S'il y a quelqu'un qui a des questions en français, vous pouvez poser en français aussi.
I have a question in English, Carolyn.
Yeah.
So with the you know, that $1 billion over the next 18 months, which was what, 4 or 5 months ago, that was dedicated for new housing, that's worth about $500 million now in terms of the raw materials that it costs to make a house, particularly, or a home or anything, because a lot of, especially in Ontario, a lot of these up to 4 to 5 stories is now wood structures. So they're going back to building wood structures instead of concrete. So at the same time, we've seen this massive bubble in house price inflation right now. How do those type of market forces play into the ability of local governments or federal governments even to create new social housing or new low-income housing? And I'm wondering, because I don't quite know the pathway, so to speak.
Well, that's really where the primacy of government land comes in, because absolutely there's been house price increases, which are land price increases primarily. So I've been tracking what's been happening with the Rapid Housing Initiative in Toronto, because I've been teaching in Toronto. I haven't been tracking it in Ottawa, to my embarrassment. One of the first things to know about the City of Toronto is that they were prepared for this announcement. They had a plan of how to spend the money that came out 2 days before the money was announced. So they knew, and that's partly because they're hooked in, but it's also partly that they've taken the effort to be hooked in. So they had sites ready. They were government sites. You may have heard about a big kerfuffle because one of the sites was a parking lot in East York, which immediately became a heritage parking lot. And, the tragedy of using this parking lot. So that's still being worked out. But they had relatively well located sites and they were ready to roll with the modular housing. And they've actually, I think they got funded to do, I'm going to say 500, but they're going to get up to 1,000 because they were very well prepared. They had some matching funding, etc. So once you deal with the land problem, and to some extent, they're definitely fast tracking those applications, so the holding costs are low. They're 2/3 of the way there to get things done, even in a crazy boom market like we're in right now. But absolutely, I was talking to a construction guy from Elliston yesterday, and I said, his business is affordable housing. I said, so how are you doing with the construction workers? He said, we need more construction workers. So, you're going to at some point come up against a shortage of skilled labor.
Thanks.
I've got a kind of follow-up question to that. It's about the heritage parking lot that quickly became a thing in Toronto.
Yeah.
So I wonder then, how do you get around the social obstacles to like this new heritage parking lot when you're trying to find more land to develop these affordable and to establish these affordable houses?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you my quick fascist answer. I used to teach participatory planning, but I have no problem in being a fascist. No, the Ontario Human Rights Commission says you can't people zone. You can't, so in Australia, there was an economic stimulus package after the global financial crisis, so around 2010. And since the applications were all on government land, there were no, they gave approvals without, they notified the neighbors, but they got rid of third-party objection rights. So they said, we're going to rezone, but I'm sorry, you don't get a say in the rezoning. So you can do that. That's not what the city of Toronto is doing. It's
Hi, Carolyn. I have a question too.
Yeah.
In your conclusion, you mentioned that this may be tested in 3 to 4 communities first. And I wonder who will be eligible for this, and if they are low-income people, are they going to pay for the experiments?
Oh, sorry, Lynn, if I wasn't clear. We're working with governments, not with individual people doing needs assessments. So we're working with the city of Kelowna. I had an extra slide that I didn't show because they've been really innovative in the past and they were up for it. We have, I'm not going to name names, but we have a lot of governments that want us to work with them to do this needs assessment and lands assessment. The next stage, should we get funding, we'll probably do one big city, we'll do one probably Indigenous community, we'll do a couple more in different provinces than BC, and it's just to test out the tools in different kinds of settings. And then we'll have a training module that we hope will lead to a new consensus understanding of need assessment and land assessment. But we aren't working directly with homeless communities. That's not where our efforts are right now.
Yeah, thanks for answering.
I have another question, Carolyn. It kind of has to do with, I guess, what we call brownfields. Did you take those into account at all when you were?
Yeah, I mean, once we have the land assessment tool, and I should say that Mike's leading the land assessment tool. So once we have that tool, we'd want to use it for 2 things. One is assessing all land for potential redevelopment, but also if we can somehow overlay what the city of New York has been doing lately, which are, you'd need a different set of data, but buildings that are presently have cheap rents but are at risk of being sold, then that would definitely go on the map. So yeah, I mean, we could definitely use formerly industrial areas, but the first priority, particularly if there's going to be scaling up of the modular housing initiative, which I'm pretty sure there is suitable pieces of government land for rapid redevelopment.
Yeah, because I'm not sure of what type of legislation there is regarding brownfields, and I wonder, because there's a lot of small ones in Ottawa, former gas stations, for example.
So then you have to add the cleanup costs, of course, particularly with gas stations. And I mean, I'm still relatively new to Ottawa, but my sense of the LeBreton Flats is that this whole ground remediation thing was a bit of a furphy, as we say in Australia. It was a bit of a delaying tactic. I think that the price of land is such that even if you include in the cost of soil remediation, when you got a piece of land as choice as Little Breton Flats, it's crazy that it wasn't developed before now. That's just, I mean, I don't know the science behind it, so I'm probably speaking out of ignorance there.
Oh, I think you're probably right.
Yeah. And I mean, another piece of land that I am eyeing in my little fantasy world is Tunney's Pasture, which is quite close to where I live, because there's no way that they're going to have tons of people returning to those buildings. Yeah, that's an area that I would say would be ripe for redevelopment in a few years. Sorry, Sydney, did you have a question?
No, I didn't. I was just accidentally turned my mic on, but I was wondering sort of the same thing about Tunney's Pasture, because I live nearby and I know that there's all these government buildings that from what I can see sort of just sit empty at the moment. So yeah, I was wondering, they probably will do some expansion there.
Yeah, I mean, when I walk around my neighborhood, which of course I've been doing a lot with COVID, I see city center just this way, and there actually is some stuff that's going to be happening to the public works yard that's just over the bridge in Little Italy. That's being redeveloped near the new Gladstone station. So there's a lot of seriously underutilized land in Ottawa, and I know that a few of the pieces of land that are near some of the new transit stations and some of the existing transit stations set aside for affordable housing, but couldn't be enough fast enough as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, we were talking about that during Mike's presentation a few weeks ago, and like how everything that's surrounding the LRTs that are popping up is suddenly becoming like super hot land, and it's not currently necessarily being, like, the people that live there aren't necessarily the ones that can afford to move out or be evicted. So it's definitely like something that's coming up more and more in Ottawa for sure.
Yeah, and there's a case right now of a number of low-income people who are going to be evicted because it's in the path of the LRT expansion. And I think that's a real shame. So again, the solution to it is not rocket science and has been done before. It's aggressive land acquisition. Ottawa used to do it a lot. I'm getting my shot off Maryvale Road that has a lot of wartime housing built. That was land acquisition, federal government producing cheap housing. The problem is that they sold it, and now that cheap housing is going for costs that are unaffordable to you students, for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
For sure.
Yeah.